My parents handed over my entire wedding timeline to my brother, after he threatened to ruin my big day. When I asked why, they told me I should have known better than to trigger him during such a stressful time. I stayed silent. That was 2 years ago. This morning they sent me photos from their hiking trip, smiling like we're just a normal family, but we're not. The moment I saw my wedding dress, shredded beyond recognition, I knew it wasn't just about a wedding anymore. This was a war, and my own brother was the enemy, meticulously orchestrating my downfall. It all started innocently enough, or so I thought. Living at home for a few months to save up for my wedding with Phil, just 2 months away, seemed like a no-brainer. But then Caleb, my brother, launched his personal vendetta against my happiness. Phil had tried to warn me for months, dropping hints about Caleb's behavior, but I always brushed it off, defending my brother. I didn't want to admit the truth. Every time Phil and I even mentioned the wedding, Caleb would throw these increasingly intense tantrums. Phil, bless his heart, would just look at me and ask, "Why do you always let your brother walk all over you?" I wanted to shout, "It's not true." But deep down I knew he was right. I just couldn't see it clearly yet. The pattern was always there, subtle at first. Just last month, after I finally graduated college, Caleb accidentally broke my laptop during our celebration dinner. Phil watched, stone-faced, as my parents immediately rushed to comfort Caleb, while I was left cleaning up the mess. And then I ended up buying Caleb an $800 gaming chair because my parents claimed they couldn't afford to replace his old one, which was apparently hurting his back. Phil just looked at me, a silent question in his eyes. "Are you really spending our wedding savings on Caleb's comfort items?" But the true, undeniable truth hit me when I asked Caleb to help assemble wedding favors. I even offered him $20 an hour. He scoffed, demanding $50 instead, claiming his disability made the work harder for him. When I refused, something inside him snapped. He looked me dead in the eyes, his voice dripping with venom, and said, "I'll make sure your wedding is as miserable as you make my life." Phil was standing right there and his face went absolutely white. My parents, of course, overheard everything. Instead of reprimanding Caleb, they immediately sided with him. "You should know better than to trigger him," they said, "especially during such an overwhelming time." They even went as far as to give Caleb my entire wedding timeline, so he could mentally prepare for all the upcoming changes. That's when the real nightmare began. Caleb started calling vendors pretending to be Phil and changing crucial details about our bookings. Our florist got a call about switching from beautiful white roses to black ones. Our caterer was told to cancel all our vegetarian options, even though we had guests with dietary restrictions. Phil was absolutely furious when vendors started calling him directly to confirm changes he'd never requested. Every single time, I'd have to spend hours on the phone, painstakingly explaining that someone was impersonating us. My parents, in their infinite denial, flat out refused to believe Caleb was responsible. Even when the vendors confirmed the calls came from our house phone, they wouldn't budge. That's when Phil, bless his logical mind, started meticulously documenting every single incident. "We need evidence," he insisted, "of what's really happening." He kept telling me with a growing sense of urgency that Caleb's behavior wasn't just autism-related struggles. It was deliberate, calculated sabotage. Then came the kitchen. One night, when our parents and Phil were out, Caleb cornered me. He calmly, chillingly told me he'd been keeping track of every single dollar I'd wasted on my stupid wedding. He promised to make sure I regretted not including him properly. When I pointed out that I'd already spent over $2,000 on his gaming equipment this year alone, he just laughed. "That's just payment," he sneered, "for putting up with you my whole life." The next morning I found it. My wedding dress. Completely, utterly, viciously torn to shreds. Finding my dress in pieces was the final devastating confirmation. Caleb knew exactly what he was doing. When my parents and Phil finally came home, my parents, unbelievably, spent 20 minutes comforting Caleb about his overwhelming feelings. They didn't acknowledge, not even for a second, that he had destroyed a priceless family heirloom. Phil, though, just stared at the shredded fabric, his face a mask of complete shock. Then quietly he pulled me aside. "We need to talk," he said. My mother, oblivious, actually suggested I postpone the wedding because Caleb wasn't emotionally ready for such a big change in our family dynamic. But Phil, looking straight at me, said something that pierced through all the fog. He refused to marry into a family that prioritized Caleb's comfort over basic decency. The next morning, a red-hot wave of fury washed over me. While Caleb was out with friends, I marched into his room and meticulously destroyed every single piece of his $4,000 gaming setup. Phil tried to stop me at first, his hand on my arm. But when I looked at him, tears stinging my eyes, and told him, I have to show him that our relationship comes first, he stepped back. He let me continue. I started with his custom mechanical keyboard, the one he'd bragged about for months. Then his monitor, the one he'd made me help him research for weeks. I saved his graphics card for last. I knew it was his most prized possession. When Caleb came home, finding his entire setup in ruins, he had what I can only describe as his first genuine meltdown in years. This wasn't his usual performance for our parents. He was actually devastated. Devastated that his actions had finally, truly resulted in real consequences. The next morning, our parents called an emergency family meeting. I braced myself. I fully expected to get thrown out. They had always sided with Caleb before. There was no reason for this time to be different. What I didn't expect was an apology, a gift, an explanation. My parents sat across from us at the dining room table, their faces showing an expression I'd never seen before. A mixture of guilt and resolute sadness. My mother pulled out a thick notebook, filled with her neat handwriting, dates going back months. Each entry documented incidents between Caleb and me. My father cleared his throat. He explained that they'd been watching our family dynamics deteriorate for months, documenting concerning patterns but avoiding direct confrontation, because they didn't know how to address it without making things worse. The notebook, it turned out, contained detailed observations about Caleb's escalating tantrums, my increasingly hostile responses, and Phil's growing frustration with our family. My mother had notes about the gaming chair, the laptop incident, and dozens of other moments where they'd enabled Caleb's behavior while dismissing my concerns. She'd even documented Phil's attempts to point out the dysfunction, and how I defended Caleb despite the mounting evidence. Caleb walked into the room just as my parents were explaining their documentation. He didn't have his usual defensive posture, no preemptive tears ready. Instead, he sat down calmly and listened. When they paused, Caleb spoke, thoughtfully. He talked about how his autism made adapting to change incredibly difficult. He explained that the wedding represented a fundamental shift in our family structure, one that triggered his deepest anxieties about abandonment and change. My parents nodded sympathetically as he articulated his struggles with remarkable clarity. Then my mother reached into her bag and slid an envelope across the table toward Phil and me. Our wedding gift, she said, even though the ceremony was still weeks away. Inside were appointment cards for family therapy sessions at a local counseling center. They'd already booked 6 sessions starting the following week. The therapist's name looked familiar, and Caleb confirmed my suspicion when he mentioned she'd been his counselor years ago when he was first diagnosed. She already knew his history, his challenges, and, most importantly, his version of our family dynamics. Phil stared at the appointment cards, then at my destroyed wedding dress, still tragically visible through the doorway. He turned to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Later, when we were alone in our room, he finally spoke. What bothered him, he said, wasn't just the destruction of Caleb's setup, but the systematic nature of it. The calculated way I'd gone about it, saving his most precious item for last. He questioned whether this was really about standing up for our relationship, or if I'd simply wanted revenge. The next morning, Caleb approached Phil while I was in the shower. When I found them later, they were looking at Phil's phone together. Caleb had taken photos of his destroyed equipment before our parents had seen it. He showed Phil each broken component, explaining how the setup had helped him manage his sensory processing issues. The special keyboard, the monitor's refresh rate, the graphics card that let him join online communities where he felt understood. Phil listened, his sympathy visibly growing, as Caleb painted himself as someone who had lost his primary coping mechanisms. Over the next few days, my phone started ringing off the hook. Extended family members. My aunt, worried about the family tension Caleb had described. My cousin, asking if I was getting help for my anger issues. My grandmother, calling to say she was praying for our family during this difficult time. Each conversation was a gut punch. Caleb had been systematically reaching out to relatives, positioning himself as the helpless victim of my increasingly aggressive behavior. He told them about finding his belongings destroyed, about my hostility toward his disability, about feeling unwelcome in his own home. And then the wedding vendor calls started again. But this time they were different. Our florist called to confirm we'd authorized a complete theme change to black and silver. When I said we hadn't, she mentioned that someone had called with detailed knowledge of our backup preferences, information only family members knew. The caterer called about switching the entire menu to foods I'd mentioned considering months ago. The DJ asked about a gothic playlist someone had submitted, complete with songs from bands I'd loved in high school but hadn't listened to in years. I confronted Caleb in his room, where he was setting up a temporary computer using an old laptop. When I accused him of the vendor calls, his composure finally cracked. Tears streamed down his face as he talked about how the wedding made him feel abandoned, replaced. He watched me plan my new life, he said, while he'd be left behind in this house with our parents. His shoulders shook as he described feeling like an unwanted burden, someone I couldn't wait to escape from. The tears looked real. His pain seemed genuine. For the first time in months, I wondered if I'd been wrong about his motivations. Phil witnessed the entire breakdown from the doorway, his face unreadable. That evening, he asked me a question that stung more than any accusation. Had I considered, he asked, how difficult this transition actually was for someone with autism? He reminded me that major life changes could be genuinely traumatic for people on the spectrum. Maybe Caleb's behavior, while inappropriate, came from real distress rather than calculated manipulation. The doubt in Phil's voice was new and unsettling. My parents then revealed they'd been consulting with Caleb's former autism specialist about the family situation. The specialist had recommended giving Caleb more involvement in the wedding planning to help with his transition anxiety. They suggested I could include him as a groomsman, or let him help with specific tasks. The recommendation came with articles about autism and family transitions, all highlighting how excluded autistic family members often felt during major life events. I was starting to feel completely isolated. While cleaning out the garage to make space for wedding supplies, I found an old notebook tucked behind some boxes. Caleb's handwriting filled the pages, dating back to when our parents first told him about the wedding timeline. The early entries showed genuine attempts to be helpful. He'd made lists of vendor recommendations, color scheme ideas, even drafted a toast. But as the pages progressed, the tone shifted. Mixed between genuine plans were concerning notes about making sure everyone sees the real family, and ensuring certain truths came to light. His good intentions had twisted into something else entirely. Something dark. The first family therapy session arrived faster than expected. Dr. Martinez, the therapist, met with our parents privately first. They emerged from her office looking deeply concerned, but their worry seemed directed at me rather than Caleb. During the group session, Caleb articulated his feelings with remarkable eloquence. He spoke about feeling excluded from family milestones, about watching me build a life that didn't include him, about the fear that marriage meant losing his sister forever. When I tried to explain my perspective, every sentence sounded defensive. Every example of his manipulation could be reframed as a symptom of his disability. Every boundary I tried to set sounded selfish when filtered through the lens of his autism. Dr. Martinez nodded more frequently during Caleb's responses than mine. She asked probing questions about my reactions to his behavior, but seemed satisfied with his explanations for his actions. When I mentioned the vendor calls, Caleb admitted to them, but framed them as desperate attempts to be included rather than sabotage. When I brought up the destroyed dress, he broke down crying about how overwhelming his emotions had been. The therapist's expression remained neutral, but her body language suggested she found his version more credible. After the session, I felt desperate for some kind of proof that I wasn't imagining Caleb's manipulation. I made a decision that crossed an ethical line. I planted a small recording device in my purse before the next therapy session. I told myself I needed evidence of the therapist's bias, something to show Phil and my parents that I wasn't the problem. The recording, I convinced myself, would prove that Caleb was performing for sympathy while I was being painted as the aggressor. The device recorded the entire session, including my own responses to the therapist's questions. Listening back later, alone in my room, I heard things I hadn't noticed in the moment. My voice sounded harsh and impatient. My explanations came across as excuses. My frustration with Caleb seemed disproportionate to his soft-spoken concerns. The recording I'd hoped would vindicate me instead captured my own concerning behavior. Even worse, it caught me making comments that sounded genuinely cruel when removed from context. Caleb discovered the recording device 2 days later. He'd borrowed my purse to look for gum and found the small device tucked in an inner pocket. He confronted me privately, holding the device with shaking hands. His voice broke as he asked why I didn't trust him anymore. He wanted to know when I'd become someone who would secretly record our family's private moments. The hurt in his eyes looked authentic, and for a moment I couldn't answer his questions. Phil's sister called him the next evening. She'd received a Facebook message from Caleb that concerned her enough to reach out. He described our family situation in heartbreaking detail, focusing on the violence of having his assistive technology destroyed. He'd explained how his autism made it hard for him to express himself properly, leading to misunderstandings that painted him as manipulative. He'd asked for her advice as someone who might understand feeling excluded from family events. Her voice was full of sympathy as she relayed his message to Phil, adding that she couldn't imagine how hard it must be for him. I realized Caleb had been systematically contacting Phil's family members, building relationships while painting himself as a victim of family dysfunction. He'd reached out to Phil's brother about gaming recommendations, mentioning in passing how his setup had been destroyed during a family conflict. He'd messaged Phil's mother about wedding planning, expressing how much he wished he could be more involved, but understood why his presence might be unwanted. Each interaction was carefully crafted to build sympathy, while never technically lying about events. The therapy sessions continued, but Caleb's composed performance started to frustrate me beyond belief. I decided to test whether his emotional responses were genuine. I created a controlled crisis by telling him our grandmother had called to say she couldn't make it to the wedding due to health issues. I watched his reaction carefully, looking for signs of calculation. His response showed both authentic distress and theatrical elements. He seemed genuinely upset about our grandmother, but also made sure to mention how this proved family events never included everyone, how there was always someone left out or unable to participate. The mix of real emotion and strategic messaging made it impossible to distinguish what was genuine. My parents discovered my test when Caleb mentioned grandmother's health issues at dinner, and they had no idea what he was talking about. When I admitted to lying to test his reaction, their horror was immediate. My mother accused me of psychological manipulation, of exploiting Caleb's disability to prove a point. My father said he was disgusted that I would use our grandmother's health as a tool for my vendetta. They threatened to uninvite me from upcoming family events if I couldn't control my need to test and torment my brother. Phil had witnessed the entire confrontation. Later, in private, he expressed how disturbed he was by my willingness to manipulate situations to expose Caleb. He said watching me create elaborate tests reminded him of the calculated way I destroyed the gaming equipment. He asked if I even recognized who I was becoming in this battle with my brother. The distance in his voice was growing with each incident. The wedding venue called the next day with truly troubling news. They'd received a formal complaint about our event. Someone had contacted them, expressing concern about a family member being excluded due to disability and mentioned threats of violence. The complaint included specific details from our family arguments that only someone present could know. They were reconsidering our booking and wanted to discuss the situation. The woman on the phone sounded sympathetic, but firm about their policies regarding discrimination and safety. I traced the complaint back to Caleb through careful questioning, but when I examined the details, I realized he'd told the truth. I had destroyed his possessions in a violent manner. I had been testing him psychologically. I had excluded him from wedding planning until our parents intervened. Every accusation in the complaint was technically accurate, just stripped of context and presented in the worst possible light. The truth became a weapon when wielded carefully. That evening, Caleb knocked on my door with an apology. He said he was sorry for making things so hard. He acknowledged that his behavior had contributed to our family problems. He offered to help fix the vendor situations, to call each one personally and smooth things over. His remorse seemed genuine, but there were subtle undertones. I'd learned to recognize comments about how sorry he was that his disability made him such a burden, how he understood why I might want to exclude him from my special day. The apology was real, but so was the manipulation woven through it. I faced an impossible choice. I could accept Caleb's help and validate his victim narrative, letting him play the forgiving brother who, despite everything, still wanted to support his sister. Or I could continue fighting and prove his point about me being the aggressor, the sister who couldn't even accept a genuine apology. Either path led to his victory. The game was perfectly constructed and I was trapped. I chose to accept Caleb's help, hoping desperately to catch him in the act of manipulation. We spent the afternoon calling vendors together, and his performance was flawless. He explained to each vendor that family stress had caused some confusion, taking partial responsibility, while subtly emphasizing my emotional state. The florist sympathized with him as he described wanting to support his sister through a difficult time. The caterer praised his maturity when he assured them the original menu was perfect. Each call ended with a vendor expressing concern for our family and admiration for Caleb's supportive attitude. Phil watched from across the room as Caleb worked through the vendor list. My brother's demeanor remained consistently helpful and vulnerable. He asked my opinion before each call, deferred to my preferences, and even offered suggestions that genuinely improved some arrangements. When we finished, he hugged me and whispered that he just wanted me to be happy. Phil's expression had shifted from suspicion to confusion, and I could see him reconsidering everything he thought he knew about the situation. That evening, Phil pulled me aside in our bedroom. He explained that watching Caleb all afternoon had made him question whether we'd been too harsh in our judgment. He pointed out that Caleb had been nothing but kind and supportive since the confrontation about the gaming equipment. He wondered aloud if the stress of wedding planning had caused me to misinterpret Caleb's autism-related struggles as deliberate manipulation. The doubt in his voice cut deeper than any accusation could have. Over the next few days, Caleb maintained his helpful facade perfectly. He offered to run wedding-related errands, helped organize the gift registry, and even started a spreadsheet to track RSVPs. My parents beamed with pride at seeing their children working together. Extended family members called to express how happy they were that we'd resolved our differences. Each positive interaction felt like another bar in the cage Caleb was constructing around me. I grew desperate for evidence of his true nature. Late one night, I searched through old phones in the garage until I found one that still worked. I spent hours crafting fake text messages that appeared to be from Caleb to a friend, discussing plans to ruin the wedding. The messages included specific details about vendor sabotage and emotional manipulation tactics. I made sure the timestamps aligned with actual incidents, creating a convincing narrative of premeditated cruelty. The next morning, I left the phone where Phil would find it, hoping he'd discover the messages and finally see the truth. But my plan backfired spectacularly. Caleb found the phone first while helping me organize wedding supplies in the garage. His face crumpled as he read through the fabricated messages. He looked at me with genuine bewilderment and asked why I would create such horrible lies about him. Phil arrived just as Caleb was showing him the fake messages. My fiancé's face went pale as he realized what I'd done. Caleb's tears seemed completely authentic as he asked Phil why I hated him so much that I'd manufacture evidence of his cruelty. He said he'd been trying so hard to make up for his past mistakes, but nothing he did would ever be enough for me. Phil stood frozen between us, staring at the planted evidence with growing horror. My parents discovered the situation when they came to investigate the raised voices. Caleb showed them the phone, explaining through sobs how he'd found these terrible messages attributed to him. My mother gasped as she read through them, recognizing specific incidents we'd discussed in family therapy. My father's face hardened as he turned to me, demanding an explanation for this cruel fabrication. I tried to explain my reasoning, but every word made me sound more unhinged. I talked about patterns of manipulation, about the need to show everyone the truth, about how Caleb had everyone fooled. My parents exchanged worried glances as I spoke, and I could see them mentally cataloging my concerning behavior. My mother mentioned that they had been documenting my escalating actions, just as they documented the family dysfunction before. The intervention was scheduled for the following weekend. My parents contacted extended family members, framing it as necessary support for our family crisis. They emphasized their concern about my behavior toward Caleb, my willingness to fabricate evidence, and my apparent inability to accept his disability. Each family member they spoke to had their own story about my recent hostility, carefully planted by Caleb over weeks of strategic communication. Family members arrived throughout Saturday morning, their faces showing a mixture of concern and judgment. My aunt hugged Caleb tightly, whispering that she was proud of how he'd handled such a difficult situation. My uncle patted his shoulder and assured him that the family understood how hard this must be. Each arrival felt like another witness to my designated role as the family problem. The intervention began with my parents explaining their concerns. They detailed my destruction of Caleb's property, my secret recording of therapy sessions, my psychological manipulation tests, and finally the planted evidence. Each incident was presented without context, creating a pattern of escalating cruelty toward a vulnerable family member. Family members nodded knowingly, adding their own observations about my recent behavior. Caleb spoke next, his voice breaking with emotion. He described feeling like a burden to my happiness, wondering if his autism made him too difficult to love. He talked about trying to be supportive despite his own struggles with change, only to face hostility and false accusations. He mentioned the destroyed gaming equipment that had helped him manage his sensory issues, the therapy sessions where he tried to express his feelings, the constant testing of his emotional responses. Family members took turns expressing their concerns about my behavior. My cousin mentioned how shocked she'd been by my anger when we'd spoken. My aunt worried about my apparent inability to empathize with Caleb's disability. My grandmother, participating by phone, said she was praying for me to find peace and acceptance. Each comment felt like another nail in the coffin of my credibility. Phil sat silently through most of the intervention, his face unreadable. When finally asked to speak, he described his growing concerns about my behavior. He talked about the calculated destruction of property, the willingness to manipulate and deceive, the obsession with proving Caleb's guilt at any cost. He said he loved me, but didn't recognize the person I'd become in this conflict with my brother. The intervention concluded with ultimatums. My parents demanded I apologize to Caleb and acknowledge how my stress had led to cruel behavior. They wanted me to commit to individual therapy to address my anger and control issues. Several family members suggested postponing the wedding until I'd shown genuine progress in accepting Caleb's place in our family. The weight of their unified concern pressed down on me from all sides. That night, Phil told me he needed space to think. He couldn't reconcile the woman he'd fallen in love with, and the person who would plant fake evidence against her disabled brother. He moved into a hotel, saying he'd be in touch when he'd processed everything. The wedding was 3 weeks away, and my fiancé was questioning whether it should happen at all. Alone in my room, I stared at the ceiling and wondered if Caleb might actually be right. Maybe I was the problem. Maybe my inability to accept his disability had twisted my perception, until I saw manipulation where there was only struggle. The doubt crept in like poison, making me question every interpretation of every incident between us. Caleb knocked on my door the next morning with a peace offering. He said he'd talk to the family and convince them to back off if I'd simply acknowledge that wedding stress had affected my judgment. He didn't need a grand apology or admission of cruelty, just recognition that I'd been overwhelmed. His generosity, his undeniable victory, felt like the final twist of the knife. I spent the next 2 days wrestling with the decision. Accepting his offer meant validating the narrative that I was the aggressor and he was the victim. But refusing meant losing my wedding, my family support, and potentially Phil forever. The trap was elegant in its simplicity, leaving me no good options, only degrees of defeat. Finally, a cold clarity settled over me. I decided to fight, using Caleb's own methods. If manipulation and victim playing were the rules of this game, I'd learn to play it better than him. I began researching his online presence, starting with the gaming forums where he'd found community after losing his equipment. I created fake accounts and lurked in his spaces, learning his posting patterns and the image he presented to his online friends. What I discovered changed everything. In his autism support group, Caleb had been soliciting donations for months. He'd posted heartbreaking stories about his family's financial struggles, claiming our parents could barely afford his therapy and sensory equipment. He'd shared photos of his destroyed gaming setup with captions about how his sister's cruelty had left him without his primary coping tools. The community had responded with overwhelming generosity, sending him nearly $15,000 through various fundraising platforms. The fraud went deeper than just money. He'd created elaborate narratives about our family dynamics, painting himself as the neglected autistic sibling of a golden child sister who got everything she wanted. He'd claimed my wedding was costing our parents their retirement savings, while he went without basic necessities. Each lie was carefully crafted to maximize sympathy and donations from well-meaning community members. I documented everything meticulously, taking screenshots and saving archived posts. The evidence was undeniable, showing clear patterns of deception for financial gain. But instead of immediately exposing him, I realized this information was more valuable as leverage. I'd learned from my mistakes with the planted evidence. This time I had real proof of genuine wrongdoing. The wedding venue situation reached a crisis point during our final walkthrough. Everything had been arranged perfectly until Caleb suddenly collapsed in the reception hall, claiming sensory overload from the lighting. His meltdown was spectacular, complete with screaming, throwing decorations, and eventually curling into a ball on the floor. The venue coordinator watched in horror as my parents rushed to comfort him, assuring her this was a medical emergency related to his disability. The coordinator pulled me aside after Caleb had been helped to the car. She explained that while she sympathized with our family situation, the venue couldn't risk such disruptions during other events. She suggested we might want to consider a different location that could better accommodate Caleb's needs. Her meaning was clear. We were being politely banned from the venue 3 weeks before the wedding. That evening I made my decision. I confronted Caleb privately with printed evidence of his fraud. His face went white as he flipped through the screenshots, realizing I'd discovered his scheme. I explained my terms clearly. He would confess his manipulations to our family and Phil, or I would expose his fraud to his online community and report him for wire fraud. The power dynamic had finally shifted. Caleb's reaction surprised me. Instead of anger or denial, he broke down completely. Through genuine sobs, he explained that the fraud had started small, just exaggerating our family situation for sympathy. But the attention and support had become addictive. For the first time in his life, people saw him as worthy of care and concern. The money had been secondary to the validation that he mattered to someone, that his struggles were real and deserving of help. His explanation made the situation more complex than I'd anticipated. The manipulation was real, but so was the pain driving it. He talked about growing up feeling like a burden, watching me achieve milestones while he struggled with basic social situations. The wedding had triggered every fear about being left behind, forgotten, deemed too difficult to love. His methods were wrong, but his emotions were genuine. We were still talking, the raw truth hanging in the air, when our parents arrived home early from their dinner. They heard raised voices and rushed upstairs, finding us surrounded by evidence of Caleb's fraud. My mother gasped as she recognized the screenshots, while my father's face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and finally deep disappointment. The moment of truth had arrived for all of us. The confrontation that followed was unlike any our family had ever experienced. Both Caleb and I laid bare our sins. He admitted to the fraud, the manipulation, the calculated campaign to turn everyone against me. I confessed to planting evidence, recording therapy sessions, and ultimately threatening to destroy his support community. Our parents sat in stunned silence as years of toxic dynamics unraveled before them. Phil arrived in the middle of our family reckoning, having received my urgent text. He listened as both Caleb and I owned our actions, each revelation adding another layer to the dysfunction we'd created. When we finished, the room was heavy with the weight of truth. No one was purely victim or villain. We'd all played roles in creating this disaster. My mother was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. She talked about how their fear of confrontation had enabled both of us to develop destructive patterns. She admitted to documenting our behavior while doing nothing to address it, choosing observation over intervention. My father added that they'd failed us both by not getting proper help sooner, by trying to manage everything within the family instead of seeking professional guidance. Phil's response surprised everyone. He said he couldn't marry me while I was capable of such cruelty, but he also couldn't walk away knowing we were all drowning in dysfunction. He proposed a radical solution. postponed the wedding indefinitely while our entire family committed to intensive therapy. Not just family sessions but individual work for everyone. The wedding would only happen when we'd all shown genuine growth and change. The next few hours were spent in brutal honesty. Caleb admitted that his autism had become both a genuine challenge and a convenient shield for bad behavior. I acknowledged that my resentment had transformed me into someone capable of cruelty I'd never imagined. Our parents recognized their role in creating an environment where love felt like a zero-sum game between their children. We agreed to Phil's proposal, though it meant losing deposits and facing endless questions from extended family. The wedding was officially postponed indefinitely, but more importantly, we committed to the hard work of untangling years of dysfunction. The path forward was uncertain, but for the first time we were all walking it with open eyes. The extended family's reaction to the postponement was mixed. Some expressed relief, having witnessed the intervention and its aftermath. Others were angry about travel arrangements and wasted preparations. My aunt, who'd been so concerned about Caleb, was shocked to learn about his fraud. The carefully constructed narratives we'd all maintained began to crumble as truth spread through the family network. Therapy began immediately with individual sessions for each family member. My therapist helped me explore how growing up with a special needs sibling had created resentments I'd never acknowledged. We worked through the anger of feeling invisible, of having my achievements overshadowed by Caleb's challenges. I began to understand how that buried rage had erupted when triggered by wedding stress. Caleb's therapy focused on distinguishing between his genuine autism-related needs and the manipulative behaviors he'd developed. His therapist helped him understand that his disability didn't excuse harmful actions, while also validating the real struggles he faced. He began learning healthier ways to advocate for himself without resorting to emotional manipulation. Our parents faced their own reckoning in therapy. They explored how their conflict avoidance had created an environment where problems festered in darkness. They'd been so afraid of making things worse that they'd allowed toxic patterns to flourish. Their therapist challenged them to become active participants in family healing, rather than passive observers. Phil attended his own therapy sessions, processing his feelings about our relationship and his own family dynamics. He discovered that his attraction to me had partly stemmed from recognizing similar dysfunction in his own background. His commitment to our growth came from wanting to break cycles rather than perpetuate them. The family therapy sessions were the hardest. With a new therapist who had no prior connection to any of us, we faced uncomfortable truths. We practiced direct communication, learned to recognize manipulation tactics, and slowly began building healthier patterns. There were setbacks and breakthroughs, moments of hope and despair. 2 months into therapy, Caleb made a difficult decision. He voluntarily reached out to his online community to confess his deception. He returned the donated money and apologized for exploiting their generosity. The response was mixed, with some offering forgiveness while others felt deeply betrayed. He lost his primary support network but gained something more valuable: integrity. I had my own amends to make. I apologized to extended family members for my behavior, acknowledging how my actions had hurt everyone involved. Some accepted my apology graciously, while others remained distant. The wedding vendors who dealt with our chaos received personal apologies and compensation for their trouble. Each conversation was an exercise in humility and growth. The ceremony planning started small, just Phil and me testing whether our family could handle even basic wedding discussions without spiraling. We chose a simple outdoor location at a local park. Nothing fancy that might trigger Caleb's sensory issues or our parents' need to overcompensate. During the first planning meeting, Caleb sat quietly taking notes about accessibility concerns while our parents practiced not jumping in to manage every interaction between us. The florist from our original wedding remembered our family drama, but agreed to work with us again. When she mentioned the previous chaos, Caleb took responsibility for his part without dramatizing his autism or painting himself as a victim. I watched him handle the awkward conversation with genuine accountability, something that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. Phil's family remained cautious about our renewed engagement. His sister organized a small dinner where both families could interact in a controlled environment. Caleb arrived early to help set up, bringing noise-canceling headphones in case he needed them, rather than expecting everyone to accommodate him. When Phil's mother asked about our therapy progress, our parents described their own work on enabling patterns without deflecting blame onto their children. The ceremony date approached with surprisingly little drama. Caleb helped design programs that included sensory-friendly elements without making the entire event about his needs. He researched quiet spaces at the venue where he could retreat if overwhelmed, taking responsibility for his own comfort rather than demanding others manage it for him. Our parents supported both of us equally, checking in without hovering or creating triangulated communications. 2 weeks before the ceremony, our original wedding venue called. They'd heard about our family's progress through mutual vendors and offered us a discounted rate for a small reception. The manager who banned us acknowledged that sometimes families need time to work through challenges. Caleb handled the conversation professionally, explaining our growth without minimizing the legitimate concerns that had led to our original ban. Extended family members who participated in the intervention slowly began reaching out. My aunt admitted she'd been too quick to take sides without understanding the full dynamic. She offered to help with ceremony preparations, but respected our boundaries about not discussing past conflicts. Other relatives remained distant, which we accepted as a natural consequence of our previous behavior. The week before the ceremony, I discovered Caleb had been accepted into an online certificate program for web accessibility design. He channeled his understanding of sensory needs into a potential career path, moving beyond defining himself solely through his disability. He showed me his acceptance letter without seeking praise or using it to prove his growth, simply sharing good news like any brother might. Phil and I had our own moment of testing when ceremony stress peaked. Old patterns tried to resurface when a vendor miscommunication threatened our timeline. Instead of spiraling into blame or testing each other's reactions, we problem-solved together. Phil acknowledged his own tendency to withdraw during conflict, while I recognized my impulse to control through manipulation. We worked through the issue using tools from therapy rather than falling back on destructive patterns. Our parents faced their biggest test when Caleb had a genuine sensory overload during the ceremony rehearsal. Instead of immediately rushing to manage the situation, they waited to see if he could handle it himself. Caleb used his coping strategies, took a brief break, and returned without the situation becoming about him. Our mother later told me how hard it was to not intervene, but how proud she felt watching both her children handle stress appropriately. The ceremony day arrived with normal wedding jitters rather than family drama. Caleb served as an usher, greeting guests without making anyone uncomfortable about our past. He prepared for the sensory challenges by visiting the venue multiple times, identifying quiet spaces, and bringing his support items. When the photographer's flash became too much, he quietly excused himself rather than creating a scene. Phil's vows acknowledged our journey without dwelling on the darkness. He spoke about choosing to grow together rather than apart, about love requiring continuous work rather than just feelings. My own vows included a commitment to honesty and direct communication, acknowledging my capacity for cruelty when threatened, while promising to use the healthier tools we'd learned. During the reception, Caleb gave a brief toast that acknowledged our difficult journey without making himself the center of attention. He spoke about siblings learning to see each other as whole people rather than obstacles or burdens. Several guests later mentioned how moving they found his honest but appropriate words. Our parents' toast focused on their own growth and commitment to supporting both children equally. The photographer captured a moment that perfectly encapsulated our progress. Caleb adjusting his noise-canceling headphones while still participating in the group photo. Our parents standing supportively nearby without hovering. Phil and me focused on each other rather than managing family dynamics. It wasn't a perfect family portrait, but it was honest. As the reception wound down, various relatives commented on how different our family seemed. The toxic patterns that had been so obvious during the intervention were replaced by something healthier, but still developing. We weren't pretending to be perfect. We were just committed to being better. Phil and I left for a modest honeymoon while Caleb house sat for us. The trust required for that arrangement would have been unthinkable a year earlier. He sent occasional updates about watering plants and feeding our cat without using the responsibility to create drama or seek excessive validation. Our parents resisted their urge to check on him constantly, trusting both their children to handle basic responsibilities. Returning home, we found everything in order and a simple note from Caleb welcoming us back. No dramatic gestures or manipulation, just normal sibling interaction. The ordinariness of it felt like the biggest victory of all. 3 months after the wedding, Caleb started his first web accessibility consulting project. He'd found a way to use his lived experience constructively without exploiting his disability for sympathy. When he received his first payment, he took our family out to dinner to celebrate, handling the sensory challenges of the restaurant with prepared strategies. Our family therapy sessions shifted from crisis management to maintenance. We'd graduated from learning basic communication to practicing advanced skills like boundary setting and conflict resolution. The therapist noted that while we'd made significant progress, the work would be ongoing. None of us were under the illusion that we were fixed. Phil and I settled into married life with realistic expectations about family involvement. We hosted regular dinners where everyone practiced their new skills in real time. Sometimes Caleb would need sensory breaks. Sometimes our parents would slip into old patterns. Sometimes I'd feel the familiar urge to control through manipulation. The difference was our ability to recognize and address these moments without spiraling. A year after the ceremony, Caleb moved into his own apartment with support from a roommate who understood his needs. The transition triggered everyone's anxieties about change, but we worked through them in therapy, rather than acting them out destructively. Our parents struggled with letting go but managed to support rather than enable. During a family gathering at Caleb's new place, I watched him navigate hosting duties while managing his sensory needs. He'd created an environment that worked for him without expecting others to completely accommodate his preferences. We were a family still flawed, still working, but finally truly moving forward.